want to take a few moments to thank Reverend Patricia and the Adult Forum Committee for inviting me to speak today and talk a little bit about my stutter and the lessons I've learned about discernment over the years as a person who lives with a stutter. To start, I've lived the majority of my life with a stutter. I don't remember exactly when it started, but I do recall it being ever present and growing in severity from about the age of 10. Stutters can take many different forms. A little bit about stuttering here to start. Forms from disruptions in speech fluency to repeated sounds. My own stutter usually presents as the former, as a disruption in my speech fluency where I take a bit longer to get some words out than others. And some days are better than others. I've known you all for a year and a half, and you all know me for a year and a half, and probably have noticed that some days you may not even hear a stutter at all, and other days it's a little bit more present. Contrary to popular belief, stutters are not caused by nerves or anxiety, though these things might influence a stutter. In fact, my first Sunday here at St. Paul's in 2023 was on All Saints Sunday at a combined service, and around 300 people were present. And here I was, a brand new deacon, in front of 300 strangers, with a good first impression to make, and I was nervous. However, if you go back and watch the live stream, which we can do now in modern times, you'll notice that my speech was completely fluent. The nerves that I was feeling in my body did not present as a stutter that day. And so my point is, although nerves can influence a stutter, they don't cause it. And calming oneself down does not generally cure a stutter or increase fluency. I was as nervous as I could possibly be, and yet I read the gospel that day without a stutter. This nature of a stutter being unpredictable inspired the recent creation of a stuttering pride flag that looks like this. You'll notice the flag, a few things. The colors. The colors are like water, the colors of water. And you'll also notice the movements, the waves. These waves demonstrate how a stutterer experiences communication. There are days where the speech is really fluent, like a rushing river, flowing freely and fastly. And then there are other days where a stutterer might experience communication as though the river has dried up and perhaps the flow is not there, and there's starts and stops. And so when I came across this flag, it's pretty new. The American Stuttering Association helped to develop this flag about 2 or 3 years ago, and I have a copy of it in my office. And as soon as I saw it, I understood it. As a stutterer or a person with a speech variation, you understand the differences in speech and how they present as water. And when I saw this flag, I thought it was a beautiful analogy. For most of my life, my way of managing my stutter was ignoring it. It didn't exist to me. I developed a method of swapping words during conversation where I would replace words I was about to say, where I could feel a stutter coming on, with words that I was more comfortable with and could speak more fluently. For years, I hid behind organ consoles or pianos or music stands as a choir conductor. You might know that I've been a musician my whole life, and those were safe places because I didn't have to speak. I can make beautiful music and never have to open my mouth. I was always in the shadows, and I didn't mind this. Being a musician, but not a solo act, mind you, meant that I could avoid having to speak in front of people, and therefore avoid the pain and fear that came with speaking with a stutter. And this way of living worked for me until God decided to call me to be a priest. And then everything changed. In the fall of 2019, at the age of 32, I arrived in beautiful Sewanee, Tennessee, where I would spend 3 years at seminary, preparing to be ordained a priest. Some of you have been there and can speak to the beauty of the place that is Sewanee. I got settled in that first month and prepared for my first day of classes. In that first week at school, I was on the road to be a reader in one of the chapel services. I was nervous, but confident. On the day I was assigned to read in chapel, I arrived early, found a seat, and prepared. The service started, and I made my way to the lectern in the Chapel of the Apostles. Let me tell you a little bit about the lectern in Chapel of the Apostles. Next slide, please. What you're looking at here is what I would have seen as I got up to the lectern that morning in Chapel of the Apostles. You'll notice 2 spotlights angled right there on the lectern. And when you speak or read or preach from the lectern in the Chapel of the Apostles, you are literally in the spotlight. And you'll notice that your classmates sit in the chairs on either side, and they're looking right at you. You're real close. You're in the spotlight. All of a sudden, the coping techniques that I had developed throughout my whole life up until that point no longer worked. Because when you are reading a passage from Scripture and others might be reading along with you, you can't swap out words. You can't feel a stutter coming on and say, that word feels more comfortable. I'm going to use that one. Other people are reading along, and you have to read what is on the page. Needless to say, I went into a full-blown panic attack, fight or flight. For the first time in my life, I was in front of a group of people, still pretty much strangers. This was in the first week of classes. I had just met my classmates. And all of a sudden, the things that had worked for me up until this point no longer worked. However, I decided, at least for that one day, that I was going to push through. I stayed and read and stumbled through the spotlight and stuttered quite profoundly that day in that first and second reading. I took my seat, and immediately after chapel, I had a little conversation with God. A conversation that would be 3 years long of trying to say no. Get me the heck out of this place. And thus began my adventures in wrestling with God. As I talk about some of the things this wrestling has taught me, I want to start with a story from Scripture, one of my favorites. And that is perhaps the most famous story of a person wrestling with God, Jacob. Next, please. This modern icon by Jack Baumgartner is one of my favorite icons. I have a copy near the front door of my home. And it depicts this story of Jacob wrestling with God. You might remember Jacob and his brother Esau were the sons of Isaac. And early in adulthood, Jacob had cheated Esau, who was the firstborn, out of his inheritance. And after that happened, Esau pledged to Jacob that he would end his life for what he had done. Jacob, in fear, naturally ran. And for 20 years, he stayed away from the family. However, God was not done with him. God told him to return to the land of his family. And before he left, naturally full of fear about what he might go back to, even 20 years later, he sent ahead some messengers to try to get kind of a feel for if Esau had maybe gotten over his grudge from 20 years before. And the messengers came back and said, Esau has an army of hundreds of people. You're going to die. And Jacob said, actually don't know what he said. Scripture does not record it, but I can imagine Jacob was terrified. And so, yet he still decided to listen to God and God's call that he'd go back home. So the night before he gets back home, Jacob has this dream in which he wrestles with an angel. And some scholars understand this to be literally wrestling with God. All night, Jacob and God wrestled. And as daybreak came, God says, "Leave me alone. Wake up. Start your day." And Jacob said, "No, not until you bless me am I going to stop wrestling." In this story, we get Jacob having an intimate encounter with God. Jacob was no doubt nervous. He had lots of reasons to be as he was preparing to go home and face his brother Esau, who he had wronged 20 years before. Was Esau still upset? Was Esau's plan to take Jacob's life still active? Going home was risky for Jacob, and yet God asked him to return. After my experience of panic at the lectern under the spotlight in Chapel of the Apostles in beautiful Salon, I had no idea what the next 3 years would hold for me. But I did know that the first experience at the lectern would not be my last. As a seminarian, I would have to read at least once a week in chapel, sometimes twice, and I would eventually have to start preaching. All that to say, this one experience at the lectern became one of many. It was early in that first year of seminary, after a few similar experiences at the lectern, that I realized this one important lesson, the first one, and that is that it is okay to wrestle with God. All those things, I don't know about you, but as a child, I was raised to see God as someone, the kind of old man that lives in the sky with a gray beard and doles out punishments and, all that kind of stuff. If you do the wrong things and mess up. And my relationship with God as I was formed, mind you, I was not raised an Episcopalian. I know not all Episcopalians are raised that way. I was raised a Baptist and Pentecostal, and those traditions taught me something about God. That God is to not be messed with. God is to not be wrestled with. That, in fact, wrestling and doubting are sin, actually. That those are signs of a weak faith life, of a weak relationship with God. That if you doubt, if you question, if you wrestle, if you say no, that you are doing something that will make God angry. However, it is okay to wrestle with God. That's what I mean. All those things I've been taught about God and myself and how I should properly interact with God, all of those things were out the window, as they say. Here I was, vulnerable and broken open. And quite frankly, upset. How could God call me with a stutter? My anxiety and fear turned to anger, and I began to question my calling. How could I be a priest with a stutter? Why had God called me to be a priest? There were lots of other folks God could have called, lots of eloquently spoken people in my class in seminary. It was obvious why they had been called to ordained ministry, but why me? This why question became my go-to refrain. No doubt Jacob may have even asked God the same thing. Why, God? Why send me back home to risk my life? With so much unknown, why would you make me do this? And so Jacob's dream became a personification of all the internal rumblings he was dealing with. In his dream, he acted out a wrestling match against God, no doubt motivated by the fear and anger and anxiety and confusion that he felt at this risky thing that God was asking him to do. It was during my first year of seminary that I came across this story of Jacob wrestling with God in Old Testament class. And this story gave me permission to do my own wrestling with God about my concerns and fears surrounding my calling and feelings of inadequacy because of my stutter. If Jacob, the central figure in the calling of Israel to be God's people, Jacob would eventually be renamed Israel, if he could wrestle with God, so could I. In this act of my wrestling with God, God became approachable. There was nothing too big or too small I could bring to God. No frustration too small about an upcoming speaking opportunity in chapel or a sermon that I couldn't bring to God and complain and worry about. I engaged in wrestling with God, and God met me in the arena. As a side note, I've also been inspired by other folks who have wrestled with God. One such person whose story that's had a lasting impact on me, many of you in this room will know, Reverend Lisa Hackney. 16 years ago, or I guess it's now 17, I have to start saying that now. 17 years ago, when I was first at St. Paul's, and I felt this stirring to ordained ministry, I had my first ever conversation about being a priest with Alan Gates. And he suggested that I speak to Lisa Hackney, who was the assistant or associate rector here at the time. And I don't remember all the details, but I do remember that she was a symphonic harpist. And she was enjoying her life. She was enjoying making music and playing the harp, and she was fulfilled and happy, as she told me, and God decided to call her to be a priest. And she told me that she kept saying no and no and no. I'm enjoying my life. Stop interrupting my life. Thank you. No thanks. And there came a point where she couldn't say no anymore, and she entered the priesthood. That person's story has stuck with me, and it's meaningful to be back here at St. Paul's. I think I had that meeting in what is now Pam's office. Lisa Hackney's office was in that. Someone else who knew what it was like to wrestle with God, to engage in the struggle, was Moses. Next slide, please. And perhaps this is the most famous stutterer from Scripture, or at least a person that has a speech impediment. The word stutter, there is no word stutter in ancient Hebrew, but we can deduct. Sorry, I lost some pages. In looking at the call story of Moses, which is an obvious one to look at, while on my journey in seminary, I realized something else important about wrestling with God. I'll get to that in just one second, but I want to tell you a little bit about the story, the call story of Moses, because Moses was called by God for a very particular purpose. You may recall the story in the burning bush. God approaches Moses, or perhaps Moses approaches God, and God calls Moses to do important work. And Moses says, not me. And he goes on to give multiple reasons, excuses we might say, as to why he's not the right guy for the job. And one of them is that he has a speech impediment. We hear in Scripture that he's slow of speech. And he's being called to go to Pharaoh and beg that God's people be made free. He was probably terrified. And so he gives excuse after excuse, and God says, okay, but I'm still calling you. Okay, but I'm still calling you. He kind of goes back and forth with him. And then there's this moment where God's wrath is kindled, because God's like, okay, enough. You are doing this work, and God says, I'm going to help you through it. And I will appoint Aaron to be your mouthpiece, to speak for you and do the speech part, but I'm calling you anyway. The second lesson I learned in wrestling with God, and we have this beautiful icon, is, I think it went back. Go forward to one. There we go. That God is found in struggle. We encounter the divine in the struggle. Some of the deepest moments of my own wrestling and struggling with God in seminary were the nights before I had to read in chapel or preach a sermon. And I would be overcome by fear and anxiety. And that fear and anxiety, I'll tell you a little bit real quick about my experiences as a child with a stutter. I experienced a lot of trauma as a child. I went to a very small private school, and the class was not the nicest, and especially to a person who has something that makes them different from all the other kids. And I was mocked and made fun of and bullied, not only by children, by some teachers as well, and as well by my principal at one point in the school. And although those things now seem unfathomable, back then they happened and they were very real. And I carried those experiences with me every time I got up to that lectern to read from the book of Isaiah or from the book of Mark. I carried with me all of those experiences from childhood. And I learned that in that struggle, every time I wanted to say no, and God said yes, I got closer to God. I learned to look at those experiences as encounters with the divine. And one of the most memorable nights for me, one of those nights before I had a big reading in chapel or a sermon to give, I was out for a walk on campus. And if you've ever been to beautiful Sewanee, it's on a mountaintop, 13,000 acres. It is gorgeous, the Cumberland Plateau. And I looked up, and I've never seen a multitude of stars like you can see on the mountaintop in Sewanee. And I remember looking up and seeing all of the stars and remembering that God created those. And I felt so small. But not small in a self-defeating way or an unimportant way. Small in a way that God is bigger than me. And that God had called me to do this work. And if God was bigger than me, God could empower me to do this work. Like Moses, every time I tried to tell God no, God always asked me again. And on the days like that night before I had to preach, when I thought it might get too hard to carry on, God showed up again and again. Over time, this struggling turned into surrender. God had called me and brought me to where I was, and God could see me through. Part of my struggling with God and surrendering to God during this time involved me starting to see a somatic therapist. I learned that a lot of that fear and anxiety around my stutter originated in childhood, that fear and pain that I was carrying with me. So much of the fear and pain around the stutter was a result of trauma that I had experienced as a child, and it was stored in my body. And every time I got up to speak, I recalled that trauma. In struggling and wrestling with God, I had found God. In working with a somatic therapist, as I came home to myself, as I learned to feel safe in my own body, my calling, my vocation became clearer and more confident. As I got to know myself more, understand myself, and feel at home in myself more, I felt God settling into my home as well. In struggling and wrestling with God, I found God. I surrendered to God's plan. I could no longer say no. I knew that God had called me to do this work, and I knew that God would see me through. Finally, I want to go back to the story of Jacob for just a moment. And I want to focus on a very important part of the story of Jacob wrestling with God. You see, Jacob didn't just wrestle with God. In the wrestling, we're told in Scripture that Jacob was injured. That he and God fought so hard, they went head to head with such force and passion that Jacob's hip was put out of joint. And he lived the rest of his life. Yeah, and he lived the rest of his life with a limp. You see, after God blessed him in his dream and he woke up and he was ready to go back and meet his brother Esau and hopefully reconcile and not lose his life, he lived his life with something that reminded him of that night, that struggle, that intimate, vulnerable encounter with the divine. Jacob had demanded in his dream that God bless him, and God had not only blessed him, he had renamed him Israel. Jacob became Israel, and Israel would be the leader of God's people. As I neared the end of seminary, I realized that in my own wrestling, I had been injured a little bit too. And my own stutter, I began to look at as my limp. I'm a person with a plan. Good luck, that's exactly it. The moment you tell God something, God changes God's mind. There's nothing more than I love than a plan. We can advance the slide. I had this mental image in my head of kneeling at my graduation and being hooded after spending 3 years of hard work working on a master's of divinity. I had this image in my head of being cured of my stutter, of being free. After all, 3 years of working on something with a somatic therapist is quite a long time. You could heal a lot of trauma in 3 years. And I did. But I wasn't healed of my stutter. What I thought would happen, how I thought that would play out, actually didn't. I wanted to speak freely. I wanted to speak fluently, not even thinking about my stutter anymore. It had been so present in my life and such a big part of me. I wanted to be done with it. Over the course of those 3 years, however, my stutter went from something that I feared, something that was a source of a lot of trauma and pain and anxiety, something separate from me. I saw it as outside of myself, as something that was not a part of my identity, something that I had to remove from myself. It went from being that to something I wanted to get rid of, to something that I had accepted. And then, finally, to something that I had integrated. It was my limp, just like Jacob. Every time I get up and speak, or preach, or read, and my speech fluency is interrupted, those moments for me, they still cause me a little bit of nerves, but those moments for me are intimate encounters with the divine. They are reminders for me of those 3 years that I tried telling God no. Like Jacob, who wrestled with God and was left with him. My stutter became my limp. It was a reminder for me of who God was, of who God had called me to be, and a reminder that God was ever with me in the ups and the downs and in the fears and in the anxieties. Every time my speech fluency is interrupted, I'm reminded that God is with me. There was a day in seminary when I remember everything changed. It's about probably halfway through my last year, my 3rd year. And I remember packing my bag and putting my books in and getting ready to go to class that day. And most students there live on campus, and so if it's a beautiful day outside, which it often is there, you would walk to class. And so that day I was walking to class and I had my coffee, my backpack. And I remember, without even thinking about it, I neared the end of the driveway. And I reached down, my hand reached down, and I grabbed the invisible hand of someone who was with me. And that person, I looked down, and I could see an invisible personification of my stutter. And at the end of those 3 years, through all this wrestling and struggling with it, I realized that I had befriended it. And I remember, again, without even kind of intentionally doing this wasn't something that was assigned me by my therapist to try out. I looked down and said, "Come on, Stutter, let's go to class. We have another class." And I smiled the whole way to class, because that day was the moment I knew I was healed. My stutter wasn't taken away. I still have days where I don't speak fluently. My speech fluency is interrupted sometimes. But healing looks different. In the healing in Scripture, in the Gospels, when Jesus healed people, often, yes, he did heal their bodies, their eyes, their ears, the things that they could see, their physical selves. But often their healing was about their wholeness. They're being healed, yes, of their ailment that they suffered from, but they're being rejoined to community. People who were disabled or had a sickness or illness were often cast out to the margins of society. And by healing their physical ailment, their sickness, they not only were healed of the pain that they felt in their body, but they were rejoined to community. They were made whole. And that difference in being healed and being made whole is what I experienced that day in walking to class. That my stutter would be ever present with me. And like many people who live their lives with a disability, I would not rather live my life without a stutter now. It is so much a part of who I am. And in fact, it has become my greatest teacher. I would never choose to get rid of it again, which I know if I could go back 5 years ago and tell, 31-year-old Gabriel that, he would probably roll his eyes. Because I've accepted it, and not only have I accepted it, I see God in it. It is my connection to the divine. So today, I encourage you, as I wish I was as a child in that Baptist church that I was raised in, to wrestle with God. It is okay to engage God in the struggle. God is most present, I think, in the deepest expressions of our humanity. And what is more human than being upset, or being sad, or angry, or happy, or joyful? In the full expression of who we are as human beings, God meets us in all of those expressions. We can bring our successes and our happinesses and our joys to God, yes, but we can also bring to God the things that upset us, make us sad, the things that we don't understand, and we can give them to God. And we can engage in that struggle, and we can meet God in that struggle. And who knows, we might end up a little bit injured ourselves too. But as a person who has been divinely injured, I can tell you, it's worth it every single time. Thank you. I did want to leave. We have about 5 minutes. We have a third service to get to, as you know, and I did want to leave just a few moments for question and answers. I know that stuttering is something, especially if you don't know a person who does, or if you don't live with one yourself, that can kind of be a mystery. I'm happy to answer questions about stuttering or my spiritual journey or whatever, but I did want to make a couple of moments here at the end for any questions that you might have. Chuck, I saw you.
Welcome to the club.
I'm honored to be in the work.
I'm very happy that I got to know you, so now I'm going to hang around you more often.
Good. I'm thrilled to be part of it.
The moment I left my hair when I was 12 years old, my father gave me $2 going into a big center to learn how to pronounce vocabulary words. and they put stethoscope in my nose, learned the ABC. When I came to the word S, forget it, S-H-I-T. Sure, but I said, pronounce words that begin with that, and I said. And I'm very happy when I hear from you today. Welcome to the club.
Oh, thank you. We actually share that in common. Words that start with S's are words that are difficult for me too. That's one of my stuttering letters. As a stutterer, there are words that start with certain letters, and S's and W's and B's and M's. Those are like my main words, and those are those words before I went to seminary, where I would try to word swap. I would think of a synonym that meant the same thing as that word, and then I would try to use that word instead of the word that I knew that I might stutter on. So we actually have that in common. S's are not easy for me to
hear those words anymore. I'm so excited that I have to ask my wife to pronounce it. She gets very slow, I couldn't pronounce it correctly. Just forget it, I think it felt.
That works.
I don't know the way to get around it.
That work? Yes. Really.
Thank you, Gabriel, for sharing that very touching and inspiring story. Deeply personal, obviously. I'm wondering if you've seen the King's Speech and if you have any thoughts on it.
I have seen the King's Speech, and when I saw the movie, it was interesting. It was an interesting experience because stutterers are not very present in film and all kinds of social media and things. And so to see a person on screen, I actually did not know that about the King. I was very young when I saw the movie, like my late teens maybe. And so I didn't know about a king who had a stutter. And to see this person on screen, I was like, oh, I can totally identify with that. And I really identified with, there are a couple of scenes in the movie where he's speaking on the radio and his speech language pathologist is like in the same room as him and kind of helping him out. And you can't see him because he's speaking on the radio. And as stutterers, we often develop kind of coping techniques. And one of those is to have like a friend that's like in the room with you to like distract you or make you feel comfortable. And seeing that played out in the film was very interesting. But I also love how even though somatic therapy was not maybe even a thing back then yet, the King did heal and was eventually whole over the course of his life. He was able to, he never was cured of his own stutter, but he did get to a place where he was more comfortable in who he was. And the words that I just used to describe my own healing of feeling safe in my own body, those kinds of words. I see that that's what happened probably in his own journey. He may not have used those same words, but I thought it was an incredible story, and I loved it more than anything because here was a person in a movie theater full of people that I identified with and no one else probably did in that theater, and that was the coolest feeling ever.
Thank you.
Pete.
So you kind of combined part of the pieces of your story. And you talked about the bullying and the difficulty and how your stuttering was dealt with in the early days. How much of that, or was it completely unrelated in terms of your journey from the, what was the term you used? I loved it,
Back to Costco.
I love that. From the Baptist gospel, you listen to church, and what's the stuttering, and you're dealing with that, you're growing through that. Was that a part of the process, or was that just separate part of your life?
No, I think it was. No, I think it was when I found both St. Paul's in Cleveland Heights 17 years ago and St. Paul's in Savannah, which is where I spent about a decade. This place and that place were both places where I was able to learn about a different approach to God. And my spirituality and my stuttering are deeply connected because the God that I learned about as a child was this kind of punitive, wrathful person. And as a stutterer, I always felt inferior anyway because of my speech variation. But then that the God that we worship was also this person that could kind of strike at the smallest mistake made. And when I found this tradition, the Episcopal Church, in my late teens, I found a place that was so different from anything I had experienced as a child. Here were spiritual communities that wrapped me in love, even on my hardest days, the days where I was wrestling and struggling a lot, there were days I didn't even know if I believed in God. On those days, this church still made room for me and still invited me in and invited me to be a part. And that love transformed my life. I remember at St. Paul's in Savannah, again, I was very comfortable behind the organ console and never left. There was one night at the Celtic Mass that we had in the evenings on Sunday, and I actually was playing the piano that night, and the lector did not show up. And the priest looked at me and was like, go read. And I panicked because I lived my whole life being able to avoid having to read and speak. And here I was, the priest was asking me to go read. And I get up to the lectern, and the reading is from the book of Genesis. And it's the story of Moses being called a stutterer. And I felt just this overwhelming presence of the divine. And that was kind of a big moment I knew that God was going to be with me. That happened at St. Paul's Episcopal in Savannah. So yes, the church and this journey is, for me, is intricately intertwined. Yeah. Yes. One more question, and then I do need to get upstairs.
I'll wrap this up with a bow. Thank you for being who you are. Your gift to St. Paul's, Cleveland Heights.
Here.
And thank you for showing us vulnerability. Society teaches us to hide the things that we don't like about ourselves. And I find that people like you sharing that vulnerability shows the rest of us that it's okay to do that. And I think we all learn and grow from each other by sharing those things.
Oh, thank you. I'll say this. As a person with a stutter, I can't hide it. It doesn't matter how much I practice a sermon. If I practice it 10 times and think of tips and tricks and all kinds of things, it doesn't matter. When I get up into the pulpit, I am going to stutter or I'm not. It's unpredictable. A stutter is unpredictable. And that's taught me to just show up as who I am and let God take the rest, because I can't control. I can prepare and perfect and refine and do all those things. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. God only asks that we bring our full selves to God, and God will take care of the rest. Thank you all.